The Tower of Babel, after the flood receded, and the ark settled on the mountains of Ararat, humanity stepped out into a cleansed world. Noah's sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their descendants began again with a fragile hope. They carried with them not only the memory of judgment, but also the promise that God had given. Never again would the earth be destroyed by flood, but the waters that had wiped away corruption could not drown the restlessness seated in the human heart. Generations passed. Tribes spread across the plains, rearing livestock, sowing grain, raising children under a sky they believed would never again turn against them. They multiplied in number, filling valleys and riverbanks. Though their languages remained one, their ambitions multiplied in secret. They shared a single speech and a shared pride in their capacity to survive. What they could not see was that the same pride would soon draw them together in a project that would stand as an indictment of their motives. They traveled east, away from the remembered mountains, until they reached a broad plain in the land of Shem. There, the soil was rich, and the horizon unbroken by stone. It was a place perfectly suited for building. As their encampments grew into villages, and villages into towns, a vision began to form, an aspiration that rose higher than any dwelling ever made. Their leaders spoke of unity, of making a name that would echo beyond the flood's shadow. They would not be scattered again. They would not be at the mercy of heaven. Together, they would build a tower, to pierce the clouds, to claim for themselves a measure of immortality. "Come," they said to one another, "let us make bricks, and bake them thoroughly." The simple words were loaded with purpose. No more would they rely on stone that the earth itself provided. They would forge their own materials, bricks of clay, hardened by fire and bitumen to bind them. The sound of furnaces filled the air, as kilns blazed day and night. The clay, shaped by thousands of hands, took form in orderly rows. They saw their capacity to transform the ground beneath them into a monument to their will, and it emboldened them. With every layer of brick rising skyward, the people felt their power grow. The tower began as a platform, then a ziggurat climbing above the plain. From a distance, it looked like a mountain of their own creation. Children watched their fathers ascend its ramps and scaffolding, carrying hods of bricks, their hands caked in pitch. Mothers whispered legends of what would happen when the top reached heaven itself. As the structure climbed higher, a new conviction set in. This was no longer a mere building. It was a declaration. The flood had proven humanity's vulnerability, but this tower would prove their resilience. They would never again be humbled by forces beyond their understanding. They would defy the God who had scattered their ancestors and reclaim the unity they believed was their birthright. In the heart of the project, something essential had shifted. What began as a practical desire for a city became a hunger for renown. The leaders spoke of power, of the glory that would draw every tribe to "Let us make a name for ourselves," they proclaimed, "lest we be dispersed across the face of the earth." Their greatest fear was not disaster but anonymity, being scattered, forgotten, diminished. Their greatest desire was to leave a monument no flood could erase. From heaven, the Lord looked down on the plain of Shinar. The vision that met his gaze was a testament to human ingenuity but also to rebellion. He saw their unity, their ambition, and the momentum that would only accelerate. He did not fear their strength, for he had given them the capacity to build. What grieved him was that they had chosen to wield that gift against the very boundaries he had set. God had commanded humanity to fill the earth, to inhabit its breath, and honor his name. Instead, they chose to gather in one place, to exalt their own name above every other. Their tower was not merely a building. It was an idol of collective ego, a challenge to the order he had spoken into existence. The Lord spoke, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing they propose will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." It was an answer that preserved humanity from itself, a judgment that was also a mercy, for if they succeeded in this ambition, there would be no end to the hubris that would follow. One morning, the tower was alive with the usual activity. Men shouted commands, pass bricks up the scaffold, mix mortars, but as the sun climbed, a strange confusion began to spread. A mason called for more, but Tumanand received only a blank stare. Another asked for bricks and heard words that made no sense. A supervisor barked instructions and was answered with a torrent of syllables he could not decipher. At first, they thought it was a trick, or madness, or exhaustion. But as each man turned to the next, it became clear. Their speech had fractured. Groups gathered, shouting in different tongues. Allies became strangers. Fear took hold as they realized no one could restore what had been broken. Arguments erupted, then violence. Families clung to one another, desperate to find someone who still spoke their language. The unity that had fueled their ambition dissolved in an instant. The tower, unfinished, loomed above them as a monument to their failure. The people had no choice but to abandon it. Clusters of families, each bound by a common tongue, left the plain. They moved outward, across rivers and mountains, into lands unknown. What they had feared being scattered became their destiny. In the generations that followed, the place was named Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. What began as a single speech became the origin of countless tongues, each carrying fragments of the old unity, but never fully recovering it. Yet the story was not merely about judgment. The scattering ensured that humanity would fulfill the command to fill the earth. In the absence of a shared arrogance, there was space for new cultures, new expressions, and in time, new stories of faith. The tower remained, its base slowly overtaken by wind and sand. Travelers passing through Shinar would point to the ruins and remember the day when human pride met divine limitation. They would whisper that no matter how high a man might build, no structure could rival the maker of the heavens. For generations, the tale of Babel was told not as a fable of primitive ignorance, but as a sober warning. Technology, cooperation, and ambition are not evil in themselves, but when they serve self-exaltation, they become instruments of ruin. The lesson lingered in every language born that day. God alone sets the boundaries, and no name is greater than His. Long centuries later, the memory of Babel would echo in a different gathering. In Jerusalem, on the day of Pentecost, the Spirit would descend on a small band of disciples. They would speak in tongues unknown to them, and all who listened would hear the message of God's redemption in their own language. Where Babel scattered, Pentecost would gather. Where confusion began, understanding would be born again. The unfinished tower stood as a reminder that humanity's efforts to ascend to heaven by their own design end in futility. Yet God, in His mercy, would someday descend to earth Himself, not to confuse, but to restore what pride had shattered.